This is a philosophy essay about generative ontology, but to discuss that topic in a way that makes sense at all, I'd like to first explain some preliminary topics, specifically something called cognitive universalism, and then something called cosmological evolution theory, and then something called strong emergence. Once those are understood, then generative ontology will start to make sense, but for the curious, let's get it right out of the way. Generative ontology is the notion that all things which exist go through a process of procedural generation. It is the notion that all existence generates structure and order through self-interaction over time. Rather than reality being built upon eternal pre-given laws, the laws themselves emerge from the interaction of energies and matter. Through continuous interaction, repetition, and reinforcement, stable patterns or routines form, which we come to recognize as the laws of physics, biological evolution, consciousness, society. Quanta interact and produce patterns of behavior across the universe. I originally called this process algorithmic ontology because the same quanta in the same circumstances acts the same universally and produces the same outcome, just like putting numbers for an algorithm. But I changed it to generative ontology as the core notion really is that this process generates, in its wake, more and more new systems and subsystems of reality. This philosophical notion is most similar to an odd mix of ideas like pan-computationalism, information theoretic ontology, and process philosophy. To clarify, it has nothing to do with simulation theory. Reality is a mathematical emulation in this view, not a simulation. Now, if you want a full explanation, let me clarify some preliminary subjects first. This is going to be a bit of a long tangent and digression, but bear with me for a bit. Cognitive universalism is a notion expressed in a variety of ways throughout history. The core idea, in its simplest form, is that everyone is the same deep down, or at least all worthy of being treated equally. It's an idea found all over philosophy. John Locke's Inherent Rights of Man, the teaching of Jesus and the Golden Rule, Kantian ethics, even Buddhist reincarnation and karmatic laws of Hinduism hint towards the conclusion that people should be treated equally, and this forms the basis of many ethical systems. There is a common theme of moral sentiments being based on an equality of consciousness, a notion I agree with, but the justification for that belief tends to differ among ideologies, and the limits of that equality between consciousness differs too. Aristotle in his Ethics, for instance, argued that only Greek adult males had the full experience of consciousness, or even a full soul. The Bible views animals mostly as lowly creations for the free use of humans, and reincarnation, for instance, posits that everyone is literally the same entity at different times. But I don't agree with any of these notions at all. They all require mystical explanations and extreme leaps in logic that consistently end up justifying evil acts towards anything that falls out of the definition of consciousness. But what then is the proper moral axiom to hold? In my prior video on consciousness and emergence, I talked a bit about my personal idea of using estimated similarity of oneself to gauge the likelihood of consciousness in others. If something is conscious or not, I think it's the same as asking, does it show signs of having an internal experience? A thermometer responds to temperature but shows no indication of experiencing or preferring anything. A scale reacts mechanically with no signs of internal standpoint. A microbe shows preference somewhat. It approaches nutrients, avoids toxins, suggesting to me enough evidence that I personally am convinced. I'd likely do the same thing in this situation. An octopus has clear emotions, problem-solving ability, a personality, strong indicators of qualia and experience. An AI could potentially show these signs, but it's harder to judge because the substrate is very alien. It would require behavioral signs of genuine preferences, emotional responses, and qualia indicators, treating experiences as having subjective quality. The challenge is distinguishing simulation from instantation. That section there explains my notion for deciding what is and what is not consciousness. Now, to add a description of what I think consciousness is, consciousness and internal perspective and internal viewpoints are all one and the same. Consciousness is the presence in any amount of an internal perspective. Consciousness is not related to intelligence. It is not even related to awareness. It is simply the presence in any amount of something able to be aware. This is why I said in my prior video, I did not care really about how conscious something is. I just care if it's conscious at all. I don't see how something could be considered conscious in any way seen as traditionally conscious if it has no internal perspective. Moving on, I posit that consciousness and internal perspective are one and the same, and I also said that one ought use an inference model of perceived similarity starting from solipsistic roots to estimate the consciousness of others. I started, however, with an explanation of prior moral systems and their failure to properly establish the baseline why behind their views on the equality of consciousness, and a failure to present logical limits for where that similarity starts or ends. I now say that I think these notions here solve exactly those issues. Consider the inference model. It explains the precise limits. If something acts like it has an internal perspective, then it should be treated as an equal insofar as it appears to share the scaffolding of all souls, which is consciousness. That consciousness is, in fact, the scaffolding from which all individual entities grow out from. It is the reasoning why behind this moral view. In my view, consciousness or internal perspective marks the same fundamental baseline for all entities. From the moment an entity comes into being, they are then altered and differentiated by the wild processes of life, such as taking in sensations, deciding its movements, and being developed into a distinct individual entity. This, to me, explains how everyone can truly be the same deep down, while all still being very different in practice. But this is just a single piece of the puzzle. So we got consciousness, or internal perspectives that appear to generate under certain conditions, usually through biochemical means, and under my personal philosophical view, these entities are basically different instances of internal perspective which differentiate and individualize by processes of experiencing life. But there's the key issue. What are these processes of life, and where do those biochemical means generate from? Okay, well, obviously, I'm not going to explain the processes of evolution or how the solar system is formed. I will give, however, a personal view which I think helps me conceptualize the universe. These two views that I hold together, I think, help explain the universe, are both ideas still debated in science, and those are, as mentioned, cosmological evolution theory and the idea of strong emergence. These two ideas, make no mistake, are absolutely not consensus science. They are modern philosophical ideas that are sometimes of interest to scientists to generate some ideas, maybe, but absolutely not considered proven or verified or anything like that. That said, I maintain that together they create an interesting and at least philosophically coherent and consistent worldview. I will return to how this relates to the earlier points on consciousness, but that's going to take a while. To go quickly through these philosophical and semi-scientific notions real quickly, cosmological evolution theory is the notion that universal physical laws gradually evolve over time. Rather than the universe operating according to fixed laws from the Big Bang onward, this view suggests that the physical laws gradually emerge and stabilize as the universe develops, and the idea will hopefully one day be falsifiable or provable by someday observing even farther back in the history of the universe. It remains highly speculative, but it aligns with the broader idea that structure and order emerge from less ordered initial conditions rather than being imposed from the outside. Strong emergence holds that genuinely novel properties can arise at higher levels of organization that are not, even in principle, deducible from knowledge of low-level components alone. This is more radical than weak emergence, where higher-level phenomena are ultimately reducible to lower-level physics. Strong emergence suggests that when matter originates in certain ways into life, into brains, and perhaps into conscious experience, generally new properties and causal powers emerge that have their own reality and explanatory validity. A brain might just be neurons, sure, but consciousness is also a genuinely emergent phenomena with its own causal force, just like the neurons themselves, not merely an illusion of neural firing. I talked specifically a bit about strong emergence in my prior video too, but moving on. How do these two ideas together form anything new or coherent? Basically, in short, I think that cosmological evolution might be caused by changes in the universe caused by the strongly emergent properties that occur and spawn into existence over time by the repeated interactions of the substances within the universe. Record scratch, freeze frame. Alright, how'd we get here? Whoa, slow down, partner. Explain yourself. Alright, let me explain. In summary, I think that the natural interactions of various substances over time generate more and more newer systems and phenomena, which then over time proceed to gradually alter the universe. In this way, the formation of natural cosmological laws are themselves not set in stone foundations, but rather the result of the process of cosmological evolution, and so physical laws and cosmological constants are end results of an ongoing process. To start, I think that all things on their primordial levels, quanta or energy for instance, go through an algorithmic-like process, similar to notions found in information theoretic ontology, process philosophy, and pan-computationalism. That said, however, let me clarify, I do not think that reality is a simulation. I think, though, that reality is a mathematical, or better said, that quantity and algorithm-like processes are inherent to the nature of reality. So quanta of substance interact with each other, and their interactions tend to result in similar phenomena. Protons attract electrons repel each other, and the same quanta interactions repeat in every atom everywhere, and the result is a stable atomic structure across the universe. Predictable chemical bonds, water always forms the same way, one simple interaction algorithm produces the diversity of chemistry across the universe. A photon collides with an electron. Despite being fundamentally different in nature, they interact predictably, and the photon's energy transfers to the electron, bumping it to a higher energy state. This interaction is the basis of all vision, photosynthesis, and how we detect light. Very distinct substances, but the algorithm interaction is consistent. The point is, substances or quanta generate structure and order through self-interaction over time, and there is, in my view, two very distinct sides of this process of generative ontology. One is that the quanta of substance interacts in predictable ways which create the patterns that build up the universe, and the second key thing to note about this view is that I believe that different quanta have different inherent properties which determine how those interactions will go. Gluon acts different from photons, for instance. Each of these quanta of substance bring forth distinct inherent properties, and I believe that anything which comes into existence must impose its own inherent properties on reality. For instance, anything that adheres to the Pauli exclusion principle, that is all fermions, impose their inherent property of taking up a distinct space under this view. In this view, physical laws have become more like the results of patterns of common interactions between various substances and their inherent properties. Rather than being built upon eternal pre-given laws, the laws themselves emerge from the interaction of substances' inherent behaviors, or intrinsic properties. These behaviors function like rules, or tendencies, or abilities embedded in each portion of substance, not imposed from the outside, but arising from what each thing uniquely is, through continuous interaction, repetition, reinforcement, stable patterns or routines, form which we come to recognize as the laws of physics, biological evolution, consciousness, and society. So we established that in this view, reality is kind of algorithmic in a way and procedurally generated. Substances and their unique inherent properties interact over time to create new phenomena. This works in tandem with the theories of cosmological evolution and strong emergence. After all, strong emergence is just the massive, unexpected paradigm shifts that come at the crucial moments in the long game of the procedurally generated process. Cosmological evolution is another obvious next step, After all, if gradual change is an inherent part of reality, then no wonder it shows up in even the most seemingly most fundamental layers of reality over cosmological time spans. Primordial quanta have inherent properties. Those properties interact and form patterns of behavior. Patterns crystallize into apparent laws. Strong emergence creates genuinely novel properties along the way, and those novel properties impose themselves back on the system, and over time, cosmological evolution is bound to occur. So how does this relate to consciousness? The last piece of the puzzle I need to deal with before getting back to consciousness is this. There are inherent properties to be found in the primordial quanta. That much doesn't require any more explanation. However, what does warrant an explanation is the idea that new inherent properties come into being from new systems made over time. In other words, this is just a repostulating of the notion of strong emergence. Strong emergence, again, in short, as mentioned, is the idea that new unexpected novel phenomena emerge from systems, phenomena that would not be predictable by analysis of the constituent parts of that system. A person who believes in strong emergence would argue perhaps that phenomena like hurricanes or traffic jams would not be fully understandable or even predictable simply through good enough understanding of the individual parts, like air molecules in the hurricane or people in the city. A strict reductionist would disagree on all points, though, and further, a strong emergence believer would hold that phenomena from such systems could be completely novel and new. A good example, again, is my prior video, which explained how consciousness and by extension free will can be viewed as perhaps new, strongly emergent properties from which come about from certain biochemical systems. Now, in my view, how I may phrase it is that consciousness comes about as a new inherent property that spawns from certain biochemical systems. The fundamental quanta impose themselves on reality. They interact and form patterns, create new systems like nebulae or gravitational orbits, and those newer systems impose their new, evolved in a way from the more fundamental ones, inherent properties on reality as well. Solar systems give rise to planetary atmospheres, which create ecosystems, which lead to abiogenesis. Another new inherent property eventually emerges from certain systems coming about from the processes of abiogenesis and self-replicating early life forms, internal perspective or consciousness, and by extension their free wills, senses of agency, and faculties of imagination. All other processes of consciousness come about. This view explains a lot of the discrepancies in philosophy to me personally. It explains how microphenomena, apparently deterministic in nature, can give rise to live experience of free will. Consciousness and free will are merely new elements of existence coming about through the same evolutionary processes but brought about everything before them. Consciousness is a fundamentally new inherent property. It emerged through the same cosmological processes that created everything else. It has genuine causal force. It doesn't just reshape reality, it is reality. Consciousness is a genuinely real causal level, not just a secondary phenomenon. Therefore, entities possessing this property are exercising a novel form of existence. In fact, this view proposes that all entities are due to the same type of natural phenomena as each other. In other words, all consciousnesses are kind of the same natural phenomena. We may share other humans the same genetic history, being members of the same species, but they're the deeper connections that we have not only with other people, but all consciousnesses. We are the same natural phenomena. In the same way that a hurricane on Jupiter is similar to hurricanes on Earth, in the same way dust storms on Mars are like dust storms on Earth, in the same way gravity still creates planetary orbits here or across the galaxy, so too are all consciousnesses bonded. They are all different iterations of the same fundamental process. So in this view, you shouldn't just, as said in the Golden Rule, treat your neighbors as you treat yourself. Rather, simply act with the understanding that you and all other consciousnesses are separate instances of the same phenomena. Unlike in reincarnation, it's not that you should treat others well because you firmly wore them, nor one day will be them, but rather because you are a different version of them now, already. And as always, thanks for watching.